Taiwan Strait. The USS Milius, DDG-69, Arleigh Burke Flight 2A, homeported in Yokosuka, Japan, is 17 hours into a standard freedom of navigation transit on a southbound heading through international waters. The crew has done this before, the ship has done this before, the Strait has seen this before. The diplomatic protest from Beijing arrived per established custom within 40 minutes of the Milius entering the northern approach corridor. The protest was received, logged, and filed in the folder that exists specifically for this purpose, which is a thick folder. What is not standard about this particular transit becomes apparent when the SPY-1D's surface track picture updates at the midpoint of the strait and shows a planned Type 052D guided missile destroyer on an intercept heading at 28 knots. 28 knots is fast for a surface combatant that is not in an emergency. The Type 052D, 155 meters, 7,000 tons, a vertical launch system carrying the HHQ-9 surface-to-air missile and the YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missile, an AESA radar that represents the current generation of Chinese naval and electronics, is not responding to an emergency. It is responding to a tasking from the Eastern Theater Command that was generated by the Milius's entry into the strait and escalated by someone, somewhere in the chain, who decided that this particular transit warranted a more emphatic response than the standard diplomatic note. The Milius's tactical action officer logged the intercept heading, computed the closest point of approach geometry, and noted in the log that the Type 052D's track, if maintained, would put it inside 1 nautical mile of the Milius at the projected crossing point. 1 nautical mile between 2 warships in a strait is not a comfortable number. It is not, by the maritime collision regulations, an inherently unsafe number. The regulations require vessels to maintain safe navigation, and professional mariners can operate at 1 nautical mile separation in controlled conditions. It becomes a number requiring full attention when one of the 2 vessels is approaching at 28 knots and the other is on a steady transit heading with no particular reason to maneuver. The Milius's commanding officer was on the bridge. The Type 052D closed the distance. At approximately 12 nautical miles, it altered course to parallel the Milius's heading, which is the standard intercept geometry for a naval vessel that intends to establish a shadowing position. It then did something that the Milius's bridge team noted immediately and the tactical action officer logged with the specificity that the situation warranted. It began maneuvering laterally across the Milius's bow, reducing the separation to a distance that the after-action report would later characterize as 50 meters at the closest point of approach. 50 meters between 2 warships in a strait. The physics of the situation deserve a moment of attention, because 50 meters between 2 warships is a number that looks very different in a navigation chart than it does from the bridge of one of the vessels involved. The Milius is 154 meters long. The Type 052D is 155 meters long. At 50 meters of lateral separation, the 2 ships are passing each other at a distance shorter than either vessel's own length. The bow wave of the Type 052D, moving at the speed of its intercept approach, was visible from the Milius's bridge wing. The navigational wake created by the crossing maneuver was felt by the Milius's crew as a physical event, as a change in the ship's motion that the helmsman had to compensate for. This is, in the language of maritime law and naval operational doctrine, an unsafe and unprofessional maneuver. It is also in the context of what the plan has been doing in the Taiwan Strait for the past several years, a deliberate and calculated communication. The message is, we can do this. We are willing to do this. We are telling you that your presence here is unwelcome at a level of emphasis that a diplomatic note does not convey. The Milius's commanding officer held course. This is the correct response. Maneuvering in response to an unsafe approach validates the approach as a tactic. It demonstrates that the maneuver achieved its intended effect of altering the other vessel's behavior. Holding course, maintaining navigation in accordance with the collision regulations, and documenting everything is the response that professional naval officers are trained to make and that the plan's maritime harassment doctrine has no effective counter to. The officer of the deck did not alter course. The helmsman held heading. The commanding officer watched the Type 052D cross the Milius's bow at 50 meters and said nothing that appears in the navigational log. What appears in the navigational log is the course, the speed, the closest point of approach, and the timestamp. These things are sufficient. Here is the operational context that makes the 50 meters significant beyond the immediate seamanship problem. The Type 052D is a real warship. Its wide J-18 anti-ship cruise missile, a supersonic weapon in terminal phase, with a range that covers the Taiwan Strait comfortably, represents a genuine threat capability that the U.S. Navy plans against in its operational assessments of the Taiwan theater. The HHQ-9 gives it an area defense capability against airborne threats. The AESA radar is modern. The combat management system is current. This is a peer-level surface combatant in many of its capabilities. And the fact that its commanding officer was directed to cross the Milius's bow at 50 meters does not change what the ship's weapon systems can do. What the 50-meter crossing maneuver reveals, however, is something about the decision-making environment that produced it. A commanding officer who has been directed to conduct an unsafe maneuver near a foreign warship is a commanding officer operating under a tasking that was generated above his level and reflects priorities that are not navigational. The maneuver communicates political will. What it does not accomplish is anything operationally significant. The Milius is still on its transit heading, the Strait is still international water, and the next transit is already on the schedule. There is a specific irony in the choice to use the Type 052D for this mission that is worth noting. The Type 052D is the plan's frontline multi-mission destroyer, its primary surface warfare platform in the Taiwan theater. It is expensive to operate. Its crew is trained for tasks considerably more demanding than conducting a bow crossing at 50 meters to make a political point. Sending a frontline warship to execute a maneuver that a patrol vessel could perform is a choice that reveals something about how the Eastern Theater Command values the mission. Specifically, that the political signal requires a platform whose capability level is visible and recognized, even if the maneuver itself does not require that capability. The Milius's SPY-1D had the Type 052D on continuous track from the moment it appeared at 28 knots on an intercept heading. The track history, built over the preceding 45 minutes of intercept approach, documents the approach geometry, the speed profile, the course changes, and the specific moment when the commanding officer of the Type 052D was directed to, or elected to, cross the Milius's bow at 50 meters. The track is time-stamped to the second. It will be in the Pacific Fleet incident database alongside the track histories of every other planned intercept of a U.S. Navy Freedom of Navigation transit. The database is, at this point, a comprehensive record of planned surface warfare behavior under political pressure. It documents what the plan does, how it does it, at what separation distances, with what approach speeds, in what tactical geometries. This documentation is not academic. It informs the U.S. Navy's own transit planning. Where to position the ship in the Strait, what speed provides the best combination of transit efficiency and maneuvering reserve, what aspect angle relative to an approaching planned vessel provides the most comfortable response options if the situation requires a course correction. More specifically, the database now contains a data point that was previously missing: the minimum separation distance at which the plan is willing to operate in a bow crossing scenario against a U.S. Navy vessel that holds its course. Previous incidents had produced crossing maneuvers at distances ranging from 200 meters to 500 meters. 50 meters is a new lower bound. That lower bound tells the U.S. Navy something about the plan's current risk tolerance under political pressure. How far the Eastern Theater Command is willing to push before the professional judgment of the vessel's commanding officer begins to push back. 50 meters appears to be the answer for this morning. The database now contains that answer. Future transit planning will account for it. The 50-meter crossing is in the record. The approach geometry that preceded it is in the record. Both will be used. Now let us discuss what the Milius's electronic systems were collecting during the 45 minutes of intercept approach and the subsequent shadowing period, because the navigation event is the visible surface and the collection is the operational depth. The Type 052D's AESA radar, the Type 346BC Eagle, in the configuration fitted to this class, had been in active search mode since the vessel departed its base at speed. The Milius's AN/SLQ-32 had it characterized before the visual intercept distance was reached. The Type 346B's emission profile, pulse repetition frequency, waveform, frequency agility pattern, power output levels, was being logged and compared against the existing threat library entry in real time. The threat library entry for the Type 346B is not empty. The U.S. Navy has been collecting on Chinese naval radar systems for as long as the systems have been operating in environments where U.S. collection assets were present. What the library entry contains is a composite profile assembled from multiple collection events at varying ranges and geometries. What each new collection event adds is either confirmation of existing parameters or revision of parameters that previous collection had estimated rather than measured. The close approach geometry of the 50-meter crossing and the extended shadowing period that followed it provided collection data at ranges and aspects that are not achievable in normal patrol encounters. At 50 meters, a distance shorter than the length of either ship, the signal strength received by the SLQ-32 from the Type 346B radar is orders of magnitude higher than the signal strength available at typical surveillance ranges. The pulse characteristics that are ambiguous at distance become unambiguous at proximity. The side lobe structure, which tells analysts something about the physical configuration of the array, is measurable rather than estimated. The Type 052D commanding officer was directed to conduct a maneuver that was simultaneously unsafe, professionally embarrassing, politically motivated, and, from the perspective of the Milius's electronic warfare suite, extraordinarily productive as a collection opportunity. The SLQ-32 operator, who was building the Type 346B profile during the crossing, noted in his post-mission debrief that the signal-to-noise ratio during the 50-meter pass was the best he had encountered in 3 deployments to the Western Pacific. The close approach was a gift. The SLQ-32 accepted it with professional efficiency. The RC-135W rivet joint that had been positioned at altitude to the east had the Type 052D's communications since it departed its base. The ground control instructions to the vessel, the communications with the Eastern Theater Command during the intercept approach, and the coordination between the Type 052D and the Shore-Based Operations Center during the bow crossing maneuver were captured in their entirety. The communications were encrypted. The plan uses better communications security than the IRGCN, but the metadata of the communications traffic is itself informative. When instructions were transmitted, how long the response lag was, what the communication tempo was during the decision to execute the crossing versus before and after. Communication tempo under operational pressure is a behavioral signature. Decision latency, the time between when a command is issued and when a subordinate unit confirms and executes, tells analysts something about the command structure's responsiveness and the commanding officer's confidence in his instructions. The crossing maneuver produced a specific pattern in the communication tempo record. That pattern is in the archive. The next time the Eastern Theater Command directs a planned vessel to conduct a close approach to a U.S. Navy ship, the communication pattern will be compared against the baseline established this morning. The E-2D Advanced Hawkeye, orbiting at altitude to the northeast, had both vessels on track throughout. The E-2D's track record of the crossing maneuver is, in the operational assessment that Pacific Fleet will prepare, the most valuable single piece of documentation from the morning. Not because it adds to the understanding of what happened, the Milius's own sensors have that, but because it provides an independent elevated angle track of the geometry at the moment of the crossing that can be combined with the Milius's own track to produce a precise three-dimensional reconstruction of the closest point of approach. 50 meters is the number in the Milius's log. The E-2D's track data will confirm or refine that number. In a legal or diplomatic context, the difference between 45 meters and 55 meters may be less significant than it appears. In the operational context of documenting planned maritime harassment behavior, precision matters. The record needs to be accurate. Now let us talk about the aftermath of the crossing, because the 40 minutes that followed it contain the story's most instructive element. After the bow crossing maneuver, the Type 052D moved to a shadowing position off the Milius's port beam at approximately 800 meters. the same distance the Type 055 maintained in the previous Chancellorsville encounter. 800 meters appears to be an operationally preferred shadowing separation for planned destroyers conducting freedom of navigation intercepts in the Taiwan Strait. This is itself a data point about plan harassment doctrine, the preferred standoff distance once the initial maneuver has been executed. The Milius's SLQ-32 spent 40 minutes at 800 meters building a Type 346B profile that is significantly more complete than anything previously in the threat library for this specific variant. The approach at 28 knots had provided the radar in high-power search mode. The bow crossing had provided a brief period at extraordinary proximity. The shadowing period provided sustained collection at a consistent range that is optimal for certain characterization tasks that require dwell time rather than signal strength. 3 different collection geometries. 1 engagement. The complete Type 346B profile that resulted is the most operationally useful characterization of this specific radar variant that the Pacific Fleet's electronic intelligence community has assembled. It will be distributed to every U.S. Navy vessel operating in the Western Pacific. It will inform the electronic warfare programming for the next software update to the SLQ-32 suite. It will be used. The Type 052D eventually broke off and turned back north. The Milius completed its transit and exited the strait on schedule. The commanding officer filed the incident report, which was detailed, precisely formatted, and included the E2D track data as an appendix. On the weather deck of the Milius, a damage controlman who had been doing routine maintenance work during the transit period later noted, in a conversation in the mess, that he had felt the ship move slightly at one point during the watch. He had assumed it was a wave from a passing vessel. He was correct about that part. He had not known the passing vessel was 50 meters away. When told, his response was to ask whether they had gotten a good look at it. They had. The SLQ-32 had gotten an excellent look. Now the economics, because this engagement has an economic dimension worth examining. The Type 052D sortie. Departure at 28 knots, transit to the intercept geometry, the approach, the crossing, 40 minutes of shadowing, return transit. Consumed considerable fuel. The operational cost of pushing a 7,000-ton warship at 28 knots across a portion of the Taiwan Strait and back is a meaningful number. Add the crew time, the Eastern Theater Command coordination overhead, and the communication infrastructure supporting the operation. And the PRC spent a real operational budget on the morning. The Milius spent the fuel it was already spending on a transit it was conducting regardless. The SLQ-32 was already running. The E2D was already airborne. The incident report was required by standing orders regardless of what the Type 052D did. The marginal cost of the collection opportunity provided by the crossing was effectively zero. The PRC conducted an expensive demonstration of displeasure. The U.S. Navy collected a complete Type 346B radar profile. Both things happened simultaneously. The demonstration was visible. The collection was not. By the time the Milius cleared the southern end of the strait, Chinese state media had the narrative. Planned destroyers had, quote, zero quote, the USS Milius during its, quote, one quote, demonstrating that the People's Liberation Army Navy firmly defends national sovereignty and territorial integrity. The planned vessel had conducted close-range observation, which is technically accurate, and the American destroyer had eventually left the area, which is also accurate in the sense that a vessel completing a transit and exiting through the southern passage has left the area. The broadcast included footage of Type 052D destroyers at sea and not footage from this morning, since the proximity at 50 meters makes filming from either vessel complicated, but archival footage that conveyed the ship's capability and presence effectively. The voiceover was confident. The framing was authoritative. What the broadcast did not mention, the SLQ-32's extraordinary collection opportunity during the bow crossing. The communication tempo data from the RC-135W. The E2D's precise track record of the closest point of approach. The 3 distinct collection geometries that had produced the most complete Type 346B characterization in the threat library. The damage controlman's mild curiosity about the wave he felt. The Taiwan Strait remains 110 miles wide, The Type 052D is back at its base in Joshin. The SLQ-32 collection summary is in the archive. The threat library has been updated, the next transit is on the schedule, the 50-meter crossing will be repeated. Perhaps not by the same vessel, perhaps not at exactly 50 meters, but the plan will conduct another bow crossing of another U.S. Navy ship in the Taiwan Strait because the doctrine that produced this one is still in place and the political pressure that generates it has not changed. When it happens again, the SLQ-32 will be ready. It is always ready. That is what it does on every transit against every vessel that comes within collection range. Bye for now.